what is the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD? So this was a question that was submitted on my website, and they wanted to know some of the differences and some similarities and just understand complex PTSD better. So thank you for pointing out this and asking more about this, because this is a great question and topic for us to discuss. So I've been thinking about this a lot this week, and really I realized that I don't differentiate this a lot in my practice, but I also don't work with short-term PTSD. So most, if not all, my clients have chronic or complex PTSD. Not that all of them have it, but all PTSD clients that I work with, it's always complex or chronic. So I don't tend to differentiate that because everyone that I work with has complex trauma. But I think it is important to look at those different diagnoses and look at what complex trauma really means. So when we say that, how is that different from just saying PTSD? Now, I don't want to minimize any PTSD ever, because it's all awful, all of it. None of it is easy in any way. Obviously, it's in the name. It's traumatic, right? But there are different criterias and different kind of areas of this. So all difficult, but there are some differentiating criteria. So let's look at that. So what is PTSD? So to be diagnosed with PTSD, you have to meet 4 areas, and you have to have all of those things. So not just 1 or 2 or 3, you have to have all of them, and they have to be reoccurring for more than a month. So those symptoms are some sort of reliving, so flashbacks, reliving the event, having like negative thoughts just overcome you, nightmares about the event, those kind of things. So that has to be happening in some form. You have to be reliving the trauma. And I may glance at my notes so I don't forget any of these. You also have to be experiencing some sort of avoidance symptom. So if it was a car accident, you are avoiding cars, or you are avoiding that certain area, or you're avoiding, the trigger or the person or something. You're avoiding something that happened within the event. At least 2 arousal and reactivity symptoms. So those are like being easily startled, being really tense, not being able to sleep, maybe being really kind of emotional, or easily, you easily cry, or you have an outburst or something. So you're really feeling pretty raw and volatile. So you have to be experiencing at least 2 of those. And then at least 2 cognition and mood symptoms. So this area includes trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event, distorted feelings of guilt or blame, negative thoughts about what's going on, negative thoughts about the event, negative thoughts about yourself, that kind of thing, and loss of interest in enjoyable activities. So those are kind of mood related, kind of depression related. They can manifest sort of like depression, right? If you're just no longer interested in any of those activities. So you have to be experiencing all of those things to be diagnosed with PTSD. Now, usually that will come on after one event. So let's say, like I mentioned, you got in a serious car accident, or something really traumatic happened, but it happened one time. It was one event. So that can bring on PTSD. Now, it doesn't always, right? But it can. Something also traumatic happening, like a suddenly losing a loved one, that can bring on PTSD. So the triggering event can look different for everyone, but it manifests in that way afterwards. And it can manifest a couple months afterwards, or it can even be later and manifest, like years after. But typically we see it manifest like after the first 3 months of the event. So that is how we would diagnose PTSD. And sometimes those symptoms go away quickly, and that's usually classified as short-term PTSD. Sometimes it takes a long time, if ever, to feel better from those symptoms. So that would be more chronic PTSD. Now, chronic PTSD and complex PTSD can kind of be used interchangeably. Some people really distinguish between all of these and some people don't. But let's look at complex PTSD. So I think the way I think about this is when the event happened over a period of time. So it wasn't just one event, it was long-term trauma and usually abuse. So if we are looking at sexual trauma over a long course of time, we see this, or I see this at least a lot with adults that had sexual trauma as kids. So they were sexually abused for 5-10 years as kids. That's complex trauma, right? That happened over a long period of time, and each event was awful and it continued to happen. So this is reoccurring. It happens a lot, in a really extreme ways. We'll see this with, kidnapping survivors or people who have been in really awful relationships and weren't allowed to leave. So that's kind of the other distinguishing factor, is that you weren't able to get out of the situation. So there's this feeling of being trapped. So not only is this reoccurring over time, but I can't do anything about it. I am trapped in this. I cannot leave. I don't have control. So that's terrible, right? That's awful. And that feeling brings on a lot of this trauma. So those are kind of the two distinguishing factors, I think, that make something complex PTSD versus PTSD. I also have seen this happen when it's not that the person couldn't leave physically. Like, you don't have to be kidnapped or forced to do something against your will to experience this. You could also be in a really difficult relationship, maybe an abusive relationship, maybe a relationship where you were just felt they made you feel like you couldn't leave or you didn't have any power. Maybe you couldn't leave because of finances or something like that. So this can also occur in that way. And some of that starts to move into betrayal trauma. And that's what I've also found interesting as I thought about this week, is there are some ties into complex PTSD and betrayal trauma. And betrayal trauma is kind of the word that we use for being in a relationship where someone was lying to you and doing all of these things behind your back, and you find out that it happens, and that's really traumatic and brings on a lot of PTSD symptoms. So I have a couple other videos on betrayal trauma, and I'm going to do another video about kind of the difference and the similarities between complex trauma and betrayal trauma. So check that out. But I just wanted to make that note here as well, that this also can fall into that line. So if you were in a relationship that wasn't technically abusive, but your partner was cheating on you for a long time or doing all these things for a long time, maybe had an addiction behind your back, a porn addiction or a different addiction, and you find out, that can also bring on PTSD symptoms. So I think that's an important note too. But when we're looking at complex trauma, it's usually long-term abuse. And so this changes us. Going through that kind of thing changes a person. And it makes sense, right? That's like one of the worst things that a person can go through. So it changes how you feel about yourself. It changes how you feel about the world. It obviously changes how you feel about the perpetrator. So it can really overtake all of that stuff. So we tend to see people who have developed awful self-esteem, awful negative self-talk, really, really negative views of the world, a deep sense of hopelessness, those kind of things. So that also tends to be deeper with this. So it's really, really intense and deep, and it's almost like a change in consciousness in the way you view the world, because what you went through was so traumatic that it changes everything and just changes your perspective on everything. So I think that's also an important note. Just like with PTSD, there's the emotional regulation problems. Sometimes we see that deeper with this area as well. So you're even more volatile, you're even more vulnerable, things are even more on the surface. Maybe you can't even do a lot and it's restricting because you're just not in control of your emotions and you don't feel safe anywhere. So that's incredibly intense. What else? I feel like there was something else I was going to address, but I can't see it. So obviously with all of these, it's incredibly intense. Symptoms of depression and anxiety are woven in through all kinds of PTSD. We also can see some borderline personality type stuff show up with complex PTSD often. So it's very complicated, obviously, and it's not an easy fix. It's not short-term therapy type of thing, but there is support and there are ways to work through a lot of this. You need to get support if you are experiencing this, because it's not something to go through on your own. There are a lot of really helpful groups on this, educational groups and support groups to help you get through this and kind of form a sense of community again. I think a big piece of this is also processing through some of those memories. So there are different ways that we can go about doing that and different ways that may work for you or not. But we need to process through some of those memories and try to make them a little less intense. I can't even remember who was talking about this like this, but they talked about kind of our trauma being in like this big pot in our brain, and therapy kind of pulls a piece up and looks at it and hopefully lessens the trauma around it and then puts it back in, hopefully with a little less intensity. So we can keep examining those, and we can't erase them, but we can kind of start to change them and adjust them and process them. So eventually we're not reliving them like it just happened. It kind of starts to go into more of a memory, and it's less intense. So that's kind of what we want to help you do in therapy. Another piece of therapy that's helpful to work with in PTSD is managing the symptoms. So helping you develop coping skills to manage the symptoms, to help you emotionally regulate, to help you come down when you go into a panic attack or you go into, you wake up from a nightmare, right? So I have a client right now that I'm helping to work on some grounding skills. So when he wakes up and he's, really, really freaking out and thinking that he's unsafe, he can work to re-ground himself in that moment. And that's obviously really difficult. And sometimes it takes time to even remind yourself that you're safe, that you're okay, that you're not experiencing that right in this minute. So we can help with skills to do that, so you can do that faster and easier when it happens. So a lot of this is that kind of stuff, is being able to better manage and cope with the issues as they arise and feel better and more in control, so you kind of have a plan. So you're not as restricted in what you do, because when you go out and you maybe face a trigger, you have skills in your pocket to manage them. So those are kind of the ways that we can treat this. Please let me know if you have any additional questions on this. We can keep talking about it. It's obviously a big topic. So please reach out to me if you have any additional questions.